Hi guys, and welcome to the Stephen King Sematary Club. Before we get to part 2, I wanted to revisit part 1 because on page 83, Paul's mom spent a day in Boston with Mrs. Kasprack from across the street. That's just mentioned briefly, nothing else is said about it. But I'm wondering if there's a tie-in to Eddie's mom from It. Because Kasprack is not a common name, and the fact that Stephen King uses it in 2 different novels in close proximity, I'm wondering if there's a connection. But also, Stephen King was drunk and on drugs during a lot of misery, so maybe that's the explanation. Maybe he just forgot that was a name that he used before. I don't know. I thought about that and I forgot to mention it. It's in my notes. So I thought I would mention it now. Alright, we are on part 2, which is Misery. So we have Annie's special edition book, Misery's Return. And Paul is really sucking up to her. He wrote her into the story, which as you read it, you just kind of roll your eyes because you're thinking, oh, she's going to eat this up. And she doesn't deserve it, and we know why he's doing it. The way that Misery died was during childbirth, and there was no way to get a doctor to her, so the fact that he just jumps into the story, Annie's not pleased, because it's like he's cheating. It's not a continuation of the previous story. So she's like, well, you have to make it so it's not cheating. So Paul thinks about it, and he finally brings Misery back by having her buried alive. So she was unconscious when she was buried. So Annie accepts this new story as fair, and Paul continues to write. He's getting really into it. He is enjoying himself. He's just purely enjoying the writing, the exercise of writing. And that has made him kind of complacent. He isn't working very hard on his escape. So he notices there are marks that the wheelchair left in the doorway from the day when he went through and really had to squeeze. A man comes to the house and tells Annie that there is going to be a lien put on her property because she has not paid her taxes. And Paul takes this opportunity to say, hey, I have some money and you saved my life, you pulled me out of my car, and I owe everything to you, so why don't you take my money and go pay your late taxes, and oh wow, it needs to be done today. So Annie goes and pays the taxes. Paul uses this time to clean the marks off of the door frame. He's really into the writing. He starts thinking about how his car is going to start appearing out of the snowbank, and he will be discovered, and he really wants to finish this novel. So Annie falls into this depressive state, and she just is despondent. She doesn't really help him. Paul wants to write. She's not there to put him in his wheelchair, so he does it on his own. When he gets into the wheelchair and wheels himself over, he sees that Annie is watching him. So now Annie knows that Paul is strong enough to get himself into the wheelchair. He was probably better off playing a little more helpless. Annie goes away again, and she's gonna try to get happy. And Paul tries to escape, but all of the doors to the outside are locked. They're locked and they're barred. So he really has no option at this point because he is still wheelchair bound. So even if he would manage to get out, he can't go through the deep snow, and he's just not going to be able to save himself. So as he's heading back, he gets food from the pantry and stuff. As he's heading back, he finds her scrapbook of murder. She has an entire scrapbook where she killed a family when she was a kid. She killed her dad. She killed her roommate in college. And then she just, as soon as she started being a nurse, she killed countless people, just person after person. And she's documenting all of this in her little scrapbook. And Paul can't put it down. He can't stop reading it. She was killing old people mostly. Then she turned to babies, and that's when people started getting very suspicious of her. and she got caught, put on trial, and nothing came of it. She was let go. And then at the end of the scrapbook, he finds a little article about himself. Quote, reported missing, Paul Sheldon, 42. Sheldon was last seen 7 weeks ago in Boulder, Colorado, where he had gone to finish a new novel. Page 185. So he goes back to bed, and he's waiting for Annie to appear, and all of a sudden he wakes up. She's on the end of his bed. She's being really weird. She knows that Paul has looked at her scrapbook, because apparently she had put some hairs across the pages so that once they broke, she would know that Paul had been snooping. Her time away, she had gotten rid of his car. She said that's no longer a problem. And she confronts him about leaving the room. And he finally admits that he left the room, but only to get food and water. And she doesn't believe him. She gets it out of him that he read her scrapbook and all that stuff. And as punishment, she decides to hobble him. Quote, the axe came whistling down and buried itself in Paul Sheldon's left leg just above the ankle. Page 205. And then she proceeds to cauterize his stump with a blowtorch. She takes his detached foot, hauls it away, and tells him that he only has himself to blame. So his legs are messed up. Now he has one less foot. He is still being traumatized. She has hidden the car, or gotten rid of the car, so he doesn't even have that to fall back on, hoping that he can be saved that way. There was a person that Annie got rid of, and he had said that he was going to explore the Overlook Hotel site. Yep, it says his pictures were going to be with an article they were doing. It was a famous old hotel called the Overlook. It burned down 10 years ago. The caretaker burned it down. He was crazy. Everybody in town said so. But never mind, he's dead. So, there we go. More Shining stuff. Annie is just she's so terrible. And she's not exactly one-dimensional, but she is very predictable. And it could just be that this book is iconic, and once you read it, it sticks with you, and it has really entered pop culture land. But I don't know, there's something very one note about her. There's just no sympathy for this character. And she's also not all that interesting. Because I feel like Stephen King has a lot of sympathetic bad people in his books, but also if they aren't sympathetic characters, usually they're at least a little more interesting. As a big character, a main character, I would say he has plenty of evil people who are bit players, and they're not as, interesting, and you don't really sympathize with them. But for having pretty much only two characters in this book, it's very black and white. Like, you're just dead set on Paul being the good guy, Annie the bad guy. It's very one-dimensional. We will wrap up next week. We'll just do parts 3 and 4 and be done. Have a spooky day.